Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. I'm with Lockie again today, but Lockie, we are way out of our wheelhouse today, aren't we?
Well, completely, yeah. I mean, just looking at the brief for this, and we're talking about a Roman guy called Maximus. So I'm thinking, I know about this. No, no, I don't actually at all. Maxwell Craven's with us. He's a historian who's written extensively on interesting things like architecture and antiques for the Georgian Greek journal Country Life, amongst others. He's written several books, including Secret Derby, and published The Imperial Families of Ancient Rome, and is here to talk to us about his new book, Magnus Maximus, the neglected Roman emperor and his British legacy. And I really enjoy this because actually some of my favourite stuff, some people will know, I guide in the British Museum, and there's some excellent Roman Britain stuff in there. So I want to hear more about it. Hello, Maxwell. How are you?
Oh, I'm fine, thank you very much. Nice to see you.
So being Roman Britain, I think we need to talk about the Roman Empire in fairly broad terms, if we can, and what Roman Britain means at this time. We're talking about the late 4th century we're talking about?
Oh, certainly, yes. Well, the thing is, at this period, everything in the empire was going fairly well until in 378, the Emperor Valens, who was ruling the east half of the empire, got completely pasted by a huge number of Goths who'd basically been upset by maladministration in their efforts to settle across the Danube. And he got himself killed. And it's the first time this has happened since AD 8, or AD 9, when Publius Quinctilius Varus had lost 3 of Augustus's legions and himself.
Bring back my legions. Yeah.
It was a total disaster, utterly out of the blue. And I think a certain amount of chaos descended because the western half of the empire was ruled by what one of the scholars of the period have said, a dilettante youth and a child. So basically you had a sort of Valentinian II, who was just a kid, and Gratian, who was in his teens, but was rather bookish and religious. So in the West, the reaction to this disaster was probably an outbreak of chaos, apart from the fact that the chaos in the East. After all, the only emperor who was any good, Valens, had been killed, and a group of generals had to suddenly get together and find someone to succeed him to stable the ship. And that in itself was a fairly tense time. And one gets the impression that although Britain had been very stable in the 3rd century, there's a great period for building villas and stuff like that. And there have been difficulties. There'd been a great rebellion in 367, allegedly, which had been put down. It seems likely that the people who liked taking a bit of booty from the British polity, like the Scots and the Picts and the Scots, as they were called, probably decided to make a massive raid. So the outcome, I think, was that Theodosius I, who was a senior general who was called out from retirement to take over the empire in the East, I think that his relation, Magnus Maximus, a fellow Spaniard, was sent straight to Britain to sort things out, which is not quite the take that some of contemporary sources make on it, because basically he himself ended up dead, and of course there was a lot of negative publicity about him afterwards. So it's very difficult to sort the wheat from the chaff. So in a nutshell, that was the situation at the beginning of the saga.
So not remotely complicated then?
No, not at all. Total chaos.
Yeah, I love it. I love this later Roman stuff because it's just complete mess, and it's entertaining. for us. So who is Magnus Maximus and how does he come to prominence?
Well, he was clearly a fairly close relation of Theodosius the First, who took over in 378 after this disaster. We don't know quite what his relationship was, but it's probably through a female. In other words, somebody's wife was his auntie or something like that. But because most of the sources have been subsequently sterilized, it's a bit difficult. But even once Sir Magnus Maximus was dead in 388, one of the senators, Percatus, gave a panegyric to the new emperor Theodosius, who'd vanquished him, and even he admits he was a relation, although he tries to play it down so hard it's obvious that he was quite a close relation. Both families came from Spain. They were both fairly well-to-do, and they both served as soldiers in arms together as young people. We think they fought together on the Rhine frontier. In 367, there was a massive barbarian revolt in Britain, and probably accompanied by a chap called Valentine trying to grab the throne for himself in the aftermath. And Theodosius's father, who's also called Theodosius, was actually put in charge of stamping all this out. The son, Theodosius the Younger, and his young cousin, we think, Maximus, we know they fought together in Britain, putting this revolt down. And after it was put down, they went on to other things, almost certainly together. The first thing they did we'd hear about after the revolt in Britain had been put down and sorted out, although, of course, it is possible the revolt was over-egged considerably by the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who was desperate to celebrate the wonderful nature of Theodosius the Elder. It may not have been as bad a revolt as it seems. They made it sound one, but they went on to fight in Africa together and to put down another revolt led by an African chieftain called Firmus, who declared himself emperor, and they had to put that down as well. So they were brothers in arms, and after this incident in Africa, the father, Theodosius the Elder, who went to Africa to sort it out, and the two lads went with him, he was murdered just at the time that Valentinian I, who was Valens, the man who died at age in 378, his elder brother was then ruling the West, and he seems to have had Theodosius the Elder killed. And the other two drop off the record for a while at that stage. And we know that Theodosius the Younger went into retirement, and Maximus may have done as well. So that's who he was at that extent. Otherwise, I've tried to challenge facts that have long been set in stone. It's always said he came to the throne in 383. I've argued that he was sent directly to Britain in 378 or 379 to sort out chaos. He is well recorded as having put down an uprising very successfully, and a recent scholar has re-examined something called the Chronicle of 452 to look again at the dating implied in it, which is very convoluted. And I've argued that he may well have come to the throne in Britain about 380 or 381, about the time he'd got this great victory. And he didn't actually cross to the continent and go particularly public about it till 383. So that's a new take on the early part of his career as emperor. And we hope that I've been convincing about it. And he issued coins from the London Mint, which is what emperors did when they were on the spot. And we think that they may be redatable to 381 or a bit earlier than his official reign started as well. So we had a big rethink about the beginning of his career as emperor, put it that way.
This just for context, and forgive, I'm going to sort of divert off a little bit and start tangenting, as I often do. But just for context, was Magnus a fighter first and a political man second, or?
Yeah, I think he was always a career soldier. I think the outcome of his becoming emperor does tell us one thing, that he was generally reckoned by the sources that came shortly afterwards that he actually did a very good job as emperor and stabilized the West very successfully, administered it very successfully, and didn't make any serious mistakes. I mean, you might argue the only mistakes he really made was to have his rival, the Emperor Gratian, killed, which I think was probably done by his barbarian chief of staff, who was called Androgathus, in a desperate effort to please his master. I've always have the suspicion that he was intending to send young Gratian back to Constantinople to the clutches of Theodosius to deal with, but it all went pear-shaped at the moment when Maximus had beaten Gratian's forces in the field outside Paris. The other thing was that he is the first emperor ever to have executed a heretic. It's a very complicated story.
So I mean, this is Christian heresy.
He was heavily involved with the church, as all emperors at that time were, but he did a pretty good job. But basically, there was a renegade bishop who believed all sorts of naughty things I couldn't possibly say in a public podcast, but
we have done probably, but
History Hack is renowned for not caring about propriety. So please rabbit hole away, because I really want to know now.
Well, I think what his variant on he was a Spanish bishop, but I think his variant on Christianity involved a certain amount of intimacy between converts. But whatever he was accused of, which may have been exaggerated, but
nothing sells your religion like "come join an orgy," does it?
It was a bit like that. This chap who was called Priscillian, he was a bishop, and he eventually appealed to the Pope to resolve the issues about him being locked out of the church generally, and the Pope didn't want anything to do with him. And then he went to the Bishop of Milan, St. Ambrose, and he didn't want anything to do with it. So Magnus Maximus said, well, I will deal with it. It's a civil matter if the church won't deal with it. So he dealt with it as a civil matter. And there was an awful lot of, the whole saga it's very contemporary in its complexity and name calling, but in the end, his Praetorian prefect, who was the chief civil official at Trier, where his capital was, basically condemned this chap to be executed, and he was duly executed. So then the church said, oh, you shouldn't be doing this, like executing bishops, it's our responsibility. So he said to them, well, you turned him away. So what do you expect me to do? We can't run the empire with people like that, leg-overing all over the converts of Spain. It's just not on. So that was the end of that. But those are the only two things that people attribute him as actual mistakes.
Interesting. It sounds to me like a very practical sort of man. And if the understanding is that he's done a reasonably good job, but he was a soldier in the past, is there any more to his reign as emperor than sort of trying to? I feel like maybe if there's rebellions going off every couple of years, then he might be a bit of a firefighter.
The one good thing was that there were no rebellions under his regime or his cousin Theodosius' regime. Things went pretty quiet. What I've contended the greatest contribution he made to the peace of the empire and to Roman Britain was that he had got to know the British tribes on the periphery of Britain, and that is southern Scotland, western Britain, what is Wales, Cornwall, possibly in Ireland. And he got to know them after this rebellion when he was a fairly young officer in 367. And what I suggested was that in 380 or thereafter, he went round and bound them to the empire by formal treaty, gave them a sort of independence under the supervision of probably an appointed prefect just to keep an eye on things, and said, we'll give you a subsidy to look after your piece of Britain, keep all the Picts and Scots out, and we'll just leave you alone. And he'd been involved already in Africa 10 years earlier in settling the tribes on the edge of the Sahara in exactly the same way. And St. Jerome tells us 30 years later that they had been settled ever since and hadn't given any problems. And this arrangement he made in Britain seems to have been sown the seeds of his later career as a mythological hero in British stories, and why his name crops up a lot in post-Roman literature. But this settlement was something it was really quite important achievement on his part. It's long been suspected, but I mean, I've just tried to give chapter and verse, and I spent some, I've devoted a chapter to each part of Britain and explain why I think he was involved, because he's got this terrific resonance in what was left of the Celtic part of Britain. So there you are.
Okay. We're going to get onto that in a bit. But before we do, you describe a long 5th century. What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm afraid to pinch that expression a bit from the Georgian group, who always talk about the long 18th century from 1688 to 1837.
Yeah, I have a running gag with Dan Snow every time he mentions his precious long 18th century.
Really?
No one cares. Obviously, people do care. But yeah, so there's a Roman equivalent.
Yeah, well, I think it is, yes, because from the moment Magnus Maximus left Britain and then was deposed, there is a period from, say, 388 to sometime early in the 6th century, where Roman Britain very slowly ran down, and a lot happened that we don't know much about. But we've only got archaeology and things like that to help us with, and a lot of written sources, all of which can be called into question. What I've tried to describe in my 6th chapter, which really links Magnus Maximus the man to Magnus Maximus the myth, that what I think happened in that period, which he actually attempts to explain a lot as to why it all came about. I mean, I've tried to suggest that, unlike some commentators who think that when the Romans left, that the currency collapsed immediately and that life collapsed back into an Iron Age existence, I basically said it cannot possibly be likely. You've only got to look at modern countries where there's been a modest collapse or a lapse of central authority. This does not usually happen in a sophisticated society. So the whole thing is, I've tried to set out how using a quote that Britain was taken over by tyrants at that time, and the Latin word for tyrants, tyranny, means usurping emperors, basically. I basically said that, a succession of blokes came along and tried to rule in the Roman fashion, not knowing that they were going to be completely separated from the empire ever from that moment onwards ever. And they kept things on an even keel, and they managed to do it on and off with varying degrees of success, right through till the beginning of the 6th century, by which time things were beginning to fall apart rather rapidly. And I'm also looked at the archaeology of life in Britain at the time. I mean, there are things recently discovered, like the mosaic pavement found at Chedworth in room 28, which cannot have been laid down before about 425 AD, and probably later. And because of that, one of our leading expert in mosaics said, well, a lot of other mosaics, which are basically clearly by the same school of mosaic makers, are also that late. So there were people in places like the Cotswolds continuing to live the Roman life long after everybody else that was taught in their school days, that we'd all gone back to living in hill forts and waving spears around. And I think the same is true if you look at the other aspects of rural life and urban life and church life. Things were bumping along, and also recent studies have shown that the currency they weren't getting any newly minted coins in, but they were using the old ones, the wear of the coins, and some recent hoards have shown that there was coin being circulated other than just being used as bullion, and fairly well into the 5th century, before things went down to being more in terms of barter. So the whole thing's very complicated, but I've tried to review the whole of this long period so that you come out of it with a fairly clear idea of what was left when the middle started to crumble, which was basically all these little principalities around the outside, run by people who thought they were descended from Magnus Maximus. So,
that's really interesting. I mean, because like I say, I spent quite a bit of time working in the British Museum, but I'm also from Suffolk, and when I think, because I remember quite vividly the Hoxton hoard being discovered in '92. 1992, I think it was, and
Yeah.
we've also got like things like the Mildenhall treasure, and there's various other things around East Anglia where you just think, right, well, everyone just seems to pack up in the early 5th century and clear off, but that's clearly not the case for much of the rest of the country. I suppose if you got the immediacy of being in East Anglia and a few hundred hairy Germans suddenly coming towards your villa, you're gonna bury your stuff and run, but that's not necessarily true around the rest of the country.
Yeah, I mean, each time a hoard like that was buried, there was some individual circumstances which we really don't know. Those two are famous East Anglia ones. They're very late also. The stuff in them's very late. But these are parts of England where there was Germanic peoples are being settled fairly early on. And it may be these people put them in the soil, expecting to come back and just didn't, which is fair enough. But I've actually discussed this a bit in the long 5th century, is that we have all these tales about Hengist being settled in Kent. And this is a very normal Roman thing to do, is to get a group of people from outside the emperor, barbarians as they called them, to basically do the fighting for them. And in return, you gave them sustenance and settled them on land. There was clearly depopulation in Britain at the time, and Kent was clearly settled fairly early on. East Anglia, but the latest archaeology from East Anglia is suggesting that there was a lot of intermixing of people, and they were settling there, I'm sure. And I've suggested it was all done by treaty, organized by whoever was in charge of Britain after 409 AD, in the typical Roman way. And in exchange, they got paid a nona, which is provisions, which is the typical Roman way of rewarding them. Where it all went pear-shaped and resulted in something called the Saxon Revolt, 443 or thereabouts, I think I have suggested was due to a climate crisis, which is well recorded, a climate anomaly, which completely wrecked the harvests, and the central authority was unable to send the supplies to keep the lads in Kent and possibly East Essex and Suffolk happy. So there was a revolt, and that was one of the first time that the established order had really been seriously threatened, and it was obviously very serious, but eventually it was clawed back.
There's nothing quite like hunger to get people rioting, is there?
Yes, absolutely.
Just on sources then, I mean, archaeology is clearly very important indeed. What are some of your best sources of this period? Do try and take us through, because I'm fascinated by it.
Well, first of all, there's the written sources. The first source we get, which is the most contemporary of all, because Ammianus Marcellinus, who records everything up to about 375, suddenly stops writing, although he lived a bit longer. So we can't rely, and he's the most reliable historian for the period from way back. But there are successor historians, Zosimus, Rosius, Sozomen. The letters of St. Ambrose are helpful because he was writing to the court of Magnus Maximus. St. Jerome, who writes about things relevant. And there are later sources like Gregory of Tours, who wrote in the 6th century, who was quoting people from earlier on. And you just got to go through those and try and work out what their biases were, and try and derive something from them. And then there was this wonderful speech by this chap Pacatus in the Senate, welcoming Theodosius after he'd put Maximus down, and saying what a wonderful fellow he was. And all the things he says about Maximus are all derogatory, but there are some of them are very informative, which is quite useful. And then you've got the problem of all the sources in Britain. The other sources for the Roman period of poor old Maximus is there are inscriptions which are very useful. There are all sorts of other things. There's numismatic evidence. There's quite a lot to go on. It's just a matter of coordinating it all and trying to interpret it. And when it comes to what was happening in Britain, all the literature is later and very dubious. You've got the famous Gildas, who was writing in the early 6th century, and he's not writing history. He's saying to the British, you're an absolute load of bastards. You've thrown away your entire way of life by being dissolute and horrible, and then uses a lot of history to explain why. And it's only partly reliable, which is a bit of a nuisance. There's Constantius's Life of St. Germanus, who came to Britain in the 420s and the 430s, which tells us quite a lot of interesting things. There's a dubious life of St. Germanus embedded in something called the Historia Britonum, written, which is often called Nennius in the 8th century, which adds something, and some things which are good and some things which are frankly unbelievable. There's Bede, the Venerable Bede, or the Venomous Bede, as he used to be called by the two famous earlier historians, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So none of them are reliable for this period. And you've got the pedigrees, which are held in various collections, which describe basically from genealogies derived from king lists, which purport to say what was going on in some of these frontier states, as the Romans would have called them. And then after that, you get Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, which is nobody believes a word of, except recently some people like Miles Russell have established that some of the things he says about what was happening about the time that Julius Caesar came, that seems to be nuggets of provable fact in it. So you have to worry about him. But as it is, nobody, least of all me, takes him at face value at all. And after that, there's the Welsh stories called the Mabinogion, which are basically very nice romances, very enjoyable. And one of them is all about Magnus Maximus. Why did they write a wonderful romance about how Magnus Maximus crossed Europe by astral travel or something very similar in order to win the hand of a lovely lady who happened to live in Carnarvon? You have to ask yourself, what do all these things mean? And that was the ridiculously stiff task that I set myself, and whether I answered it, I don't know. But I mean, I've devoted a bit of time in the Roman section about Magnus Maximus, about Carnarvon, because it does have resonance with him. But whether the memory of it lingered till the 11th or 12th centuries, I don't know. But I rather suspect it somehow did. So
it's not quite as depressing as I thought it was in terms of sources, Lockie. I mean, obviously, we're 20th century historians. We are so spoiled rotten, it's unbelievable. But it's not as bad as I thought it was.
No, it's not. It's not as bad as you think it is, but it's got more pitfalls in it than you thought.
Yeah.
You almost wonder if a story like, I don't know, ends up being Havelock the Dane and then goes on to become a Hamlet later on, and then it's the Lion King, and it's
yeah.
I don't think any of these ones have made it that far to become the Mabinogion. It really that was it.
Okay. You've already alluded to the fact Maximus, so he's considered a bit of a founding father of several Roman polities, isn't he?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yes. I mean, he's you can look at him. Well, the people who were ruling places like northeast Scotland, Galloway, Isle of Man, Demetia, that is what is modern Pembrokeshire and Carmarthen, Powys, possibly much of North Wales, and possibly Dumnonia, all have claims to Magnus Maximus in various legendary sources. And these all derive, really, from people who were supposed to be sons of him, which really is a very strange concept, because if he had that many sons, he must have been a very busy man.
Yeah, so that's one of the terms that we have here, isn't it? Who are the sons of Maximus?
Yeah, well, first of all, he had a real Roman son whose existence is well attested in Roman history, who was called Victor, who was his co-emperor and was probably a teenager, and he left him in Trier when he moved to Italy to dislodge Valentinian II. He left him there as the ruler under the tutelage of a couple of generals, one of whom I suspect was totally incompetent, but that's a detail. So he had a real son, we know that. But all of these dynasties claim to have been founded by another son. In fact, I can count 6 of them. There was one called Dimet, who was founded the kingdom of Demetia. He's actually an Irishman who had been settled there, probably under Magnus Maximus, to protect the underpopulated southwest corner of Wales. He came from a tribe, a group of Irish families who had fallen out with with their local king and were sort of living a wandering life until they were transplanted by Maximus, who clearly had very strong connections in Ireland. And his dynasty, it starts off with a couple of Irish people you can say pretty sure existed. Then they put Maximus in. Then they give him a son called Dimet, which is just to explain the name of the kingdom. And then it eventually comes to some names like Agricola, and who's called, or in Welsh, Ercol, who is a real person who we actually know existed. And then there's another one called Anton, or Antonius, who was founded a dynasty in the north. One called Owen Findhu, or Eugene Blacklips, who also founded a dynasty in the north. And there's another one called Donatus, or Donat, who founded a dynasty in Galloway, and probably renewed the dynasty of Strathclyde. And another one called Ednived, who doesn't have a Welsh, a Roman name, who had a dynasty in the north, and then that man called, and there's two Irish pedigrees in one of the Irish collections who give him a son called Leo, about which nobody knows anything except he left a lot of Irish descendants. So you have to think, who the hell were these people, and why were they connected up? And what I've tried to say is that when he was settling the frontiers in the 380s, each one of the head man of each of these groups was given a status. They signed a treaty, they got a subsidy, they probably were given a prefect to look after them. And this man, his descendants, when they became more literary, turned what was a list of local rulers, starting with Maximus, who'd set the whole thing up, and grafted them onto the family trees. And in fact, I think you can look at the names I've gone through, and you can reduce them to 4 pretty easily, of which the most interesting is the one called Owen Blacklips, because he is the one who I think is probably the name of the person who took over Britain in 409, when the officials of Constantine III were thrown out, because he keeps cropping up in all sorts of places. And the dynasty he left is non-existent, which is typical of people who are associated with the middle of Britain at this period. You don't find any genuine pedigrees relating to people like Ambrosius, Aurelianus, or King Arthur, or anybody like that. Probably because if they did exist, which I'm sure some of them did, they were in the middle part of England. And as catastrophe overcame that, and the Germanic dynasties emerged from the wreckage in the 6th century, the records all just went up the spout. So there was no legendary background for them to get welded onto British dynasties in the edges of the country. But he's quite an interesting one. I think the one called Antonius is the same as the one called Donatus. I think they were the same man. And they founded a dynasty that ruled Galloway as well as Strathclyde. And one of them broke away and ruled in the Isle of Man. And the king of the Isle of Man married the heiress of the kingdom of Gwynedd much later on. And so the kings of Gwynedd right down to Llewellyn the Last, I think, probably claim to be descendants of Magnus Maximus. So these sons of Maximus, they were everywhere. There were a lot of them, and the thing is, we don't think for a moment they existed, but they were people associated with the founding of the Celtic polities that ringed central Britain, and which basically survived a long time. The last surviving one of them was snuffed out in 1282. It was the last unconquered part of the Western Empire, when Edward I finally conquered Wales.
That's such an interesting way of looking at it. I wouldn't ever have considered Edward I's campaigning to be kicking the last vestiges of Roman Britain out.
Yeah.
Is it? I mean, this drive westward, I mean, the west and north, that's just a kind of result of the Germanic invasions. And Maximus did he have any particular links to Wales beyond, his what we term his sons?
Well, one thing I attribute, which I do attribute to him, which is sometimes attributed to Theodosius the Elder after the barbarian uprising of 367, but I think is probably the work of Maximus, is the total reorganization of the Welsh coastal defences, because they were suffering from incursions of Irish. There's plenty of archaeological proof of that as well. And he refortified Saguntium, Carnarvon, built a separate fort not far away from the one that the main fort there, called which survives quite to a considerable size at a place called Hen Walliau. There's a place called Dinas Dentley on the coast further away, where there's almost certainly a watchtower or possibly a lighthouse. He reinforced Holyhead at Caergiddy, and there were other signal stations believed to have been put up around the North Wales coast, which have eroded away or otherwise vanished. The refortification of the Saxon shore type fort at Cardiff may well have been his work. So he strengthened Wales on the edge, and in the middle of Wales, all the forts that had been there from the conquest onwards were vacated. So presumably, having struck deals with various tribal leaders in what is now Wales, he didn't need to police the middle of Wales anymore. So he could take the troops away and, if necessary, use them in other theatres. But he did strengthen the coasts of Wales in the same way that 100 years earlier they'd strengthened the coasts of Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Kent, Sussex, with the Saxon shore forts. So I think that's one of his connections with Wales. And the other great connection with Wales, of course, is if you go to Llangollen and look at the Pillar of Eliseg, which is what looks like a Roman pillar, but is believed to be post-Roman, but is big and impressive, and was clearly made by somebody who knew something about classical architecture, and was originally a standing cross. And it had a big inscription on it, basically outlining the glories of the princes of Powys. And amongst it is the statement that Magnus Maximus had a daughter called Severa, which is a perfectly reasonable name for her, who married Vortigern, the famous Vortigern, and that their children were the kings of Powys and various other minor principalities. And one of them was St. Faustus, who was a bishop in Gaul and a great friend of Sidonius Apollinaris. It's so unlikely, but there it is. It's one of the earliest pieces of the evidence, really, because the pillar was set up in the 8th century rather than the 9th, and it predates the Historia Brittonum by a little bit. So it's quite an interesting source. And if that alliance took place, it means that Magnus Maximus had some kind of input into the founding of Powys, which probably began with Wroxeter as a nucleus. And there are other ones like it. There's a notional daughter of Magnus Maximus, or possibly somebody else, of a Roman emperor, who marries into the dynasty ruling Dumnonia of Devon and Cornwall. So they were everywhere, these allusions. But his links to Wales were chiefly through this connection with refortifying the Welsh coast, and of course in the Mabinogion, this wonderful story in the 12th century. Carnarvon is where it all happens, where he goes to seek this bride, and then sallies forth therefrom for further adventures, which includes the retaking of Rome itself. So and a lot of this legendary material all ended up in Wales anyway, because with the fall of the northern kingdoms, gradually, until only Strathclyde was left, all the literature seems to have found its way to Wales, which is how it survived. Which is rather fine. And then there was the thing about North Wales. North Wales is always said to have been founded by a man called Cuneva, who was a Votadinian prince. That is to say, he came from the northeast Scottish lowlands. His capital was Edinburgh, Caer Eden. John Cock has proved, I think, very conclusively that he never went to Wales at all, but the Welsh dynasty of Gwynedd claimed descent from him, and he's alleged to have had all these sons. And all these sons, who must have lived in the early 5th century, if not a bit earlier, 1, 2, 3, I'll just refresh my memory, 8 of them, all but 2 have got Roman names. Tibaean, Osvail, Reuven, Dunod, Keretic, Anion, Dogvail, Aedan. There were probably Tiberianus, Ishmael, Romanus, Donatus, Annianus, and Aeternalis. They were probably Roman officers sent up to get the Irish out of the North Wales area. And they found dynasties. And one of them had a grandson called Marian, probably Marinianus, who gave they nearly all gave their names to parts of Wales or counties, which have all been subsequently abolished. And that's another connection, because I suspect that it's either under Maximus's settlement or continuations of it that they were sent up there, and they somehow managed to put down roots and never got away again. They thought they went native.
Does it seem like his strength and his ability to manage his empire is almost? I'm sort of seeking other parallels in history now. I'm almost thinking Alexander, after his death, his empire then breaks up, and the great Assyrian empire of Ashurbanipal breaks up after his death. Is there something kind of parallel in that? Is there a real strength that then is unmaintainable thereafter?
Well, I'm not sure, because all the people who broke Alexander's empire up thought they were all as good as he was. So they decided they were all entitled to a bit of the action, whereas all these chaps are quite happy in their own little native areas, being a king of their own little castles and doing a really good job. They didn't have there's no sign of them wanting to replace him. When he fell, he was replaced by another Roman emperor, basically. So I don't think it's the same sort of thing at all. He did a good job in Britain, I think. I think he preserved Britain, basically, for much longer than it might have been expected. Although he probably didn't realize it. And I'm sure the reason he did it to some extent was so he could free a lot of frontier forces for his own use on the continent and so forth. Because he's always accused by some of the contemporary sources of stripping Britain of their troops. Well, probably did, but he actually had such a strong settlement that there wasn't really any trouble. You don't read of any trouble except allegedly in the 390s, when the Western warlord, Stilicho, was said to have come to Britain to put down yet another rebellion. And there's a long panegyric about how wonderful it was. And I'm not sure, a lot of scholars don't believe a word of it. It was just they had to bolt a few things onto his career to make him sound frightfully grand. But he spent most of his time firefighting on the continent, of waves of people crossing the Rhine or coming up from the Danube and causing trouble for the Western Empire. So it's a somewhat of a difference, I think, really.
So Maximus's legacy, then, I suppose, is it different on the continent versus here in Britain, or how is he remembered more broadly, perhaps?
Well, on the continent, it's clear that some of the sources that written 5th century chroniclers took a fairly favourable view of him. We don't really know how and you get the view from people like Ambrosius, St. Ambrose, that he wasn't a bad chap. And one of the most famous of Western senators, Quintus Aurelius Symmachus, went as far as to write a panegyric for him when he conquered Italy and became emperor there, which if only it had survived, would have solved all our problems. It probably told us a lot of somewhat inflated truths about him. But of course, he had to very quickly stick it on the bonfire when Maximus fell and make his peace with Theodosius I. So we don't. But if people as sophisticated as him were busy taking a fairly favourable view and writing to him, then I think on the continent the general impression was that he was all right, and also I think one thing I did explore slightly was he almost certainly had at least two daughters, which vaguely attested. One had mental health problems and was cured of it by a man called St. Elidius in Trier. And then either the same daughter or another one almost certainly married a very high senior Roman aristocrat and was almost certainly the mother of the Emperor Petronius Maximus, who came to power by killing Valentinian III in 455. And if you look at that, it's a grandson of Theodosius, who killed Magnus Maximus, being killed by a grandson of Magnus Maximus. It's almost like was there a 3-generation grudge being settled at that time? I don't know. It's very strange. But a modern piece of research was published about 10 years ago, suggesting that this was the case. And I must say, I find it very convincing. And of course, he had a wife who was keen. They were both very keen church people. I mean, Magnus Maximus said he went straight from the font to the throne. He was baptized when he was elevated as emperor, and he was very keen on Christianity ever since. And his wife was, because she got into conversation with St. Martin, whom she served at table in a very humble way to show how much she admired him. Which also proves, of course, that St. Martin thought that Magnus Maximus was a pretty good egg if he was prepared to go and have supper with him and spend time in trio with him. So the impression is that he was actually a reasonably good egg. And all said and done.
It's funny that he should be less famous. Well, I suppose it's the product of the time he lived in more than anything else. His
demise was unfortunate because when he invaded Italy, he wanted to spare Valentinian II, who was still only a child, basically, from being murdered. Didn't want to make a mistake that happened when his other adversary, Gratian, was murdered unceremoniously and very, very treacherously. So he packed him off he escaped with his mother and sister to the court at Constantinople. And even when they got to Constantinople, Theodosius didn't really want to do anything about it. So I'm absolutely sure that the game plan between Maximus and Theodosius was to replace these two offspring of the Valentinian dynasty with a dynasty of their own. But unfortunately, the mother of Valentinian II, Justina, was a scheming woman and produced her daughter Galla before Theodosius, who'd just been widowed, and it was instant attraction. Theodosius became completely besotted, we're told by Zosimus, who this is often dismissed as myth or fantasy, but I think it's totally human. He became so besotted that he changed his mind about whether he was going to dislodge Maximus. He wanted to marry this Galla, and Justina said, "We will marry her. You've got to get rid of Maximus." So in the end, he married her and sent an expeditionary force to get rid of Maximus. And the result was that Maximus's memory was blotted out as effectively as possible. So, sad, but true.
Well, we now have some more literature to read up on him. Maxwell, tell us a little bit about your book, if you can.
About what?
About your book. Is it out now?
It's out on the 15th of March, 3 days after my daughter gets married. So I shall be too shell-shocked to appreciate it, probably. But yeah, it's coming out on the 15th of March from Amberley, 25 quid a shot. And I hope people read it. I've tried to base everything I've said on with academic rigor as much as I can summon up. So it is footnoted, but at the back, so you don't need to look at the footnote. You can just read what it says and see if you believe it or not. But I've tried to make a convincing case for the chap, and I've tried to put him back on the map and tried to explain why Britain should be especially grateful to him in their way. So, you know, I hope it, and I hope I tried to make it readable, which is one of
that's what we all try for, I think. This sounds absolutely fascinating. I love the sound of this. I think it's a really interesting time for Britain as well. So we shall do our best for you. Anyway, I've enjoyed this conversation and I recommend it to you. Maxwell, thank you ever so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Alex. It's been a pleasure.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/History Hack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.